Hi, welcome to this episode of The Inner. Today I have with me Jabari Osaze. Hi, brother Jabari.
Pete, how are you?
So, if you would introduce yourself to the people.
As you said, my name is Jabari Osaze. I'm the chief priest of the Shrine of Ma'at and also the co-founder of the Center for the Restoration of Ma'at. My Kemetic name is Heru Jeden Ma'at Aten Ra. I've spent really my entire adult life exploring and practicing an ancient African spiritual tradition coming out of that land known as ancient Egypt, that really should be known as ancient Kemet. And in many ways, this journey has taken me in I'd say really on a sojourn that I could not have imagined. It's allowed me to really travel the world, to meet different practitioners in different portions of the world. I've traveled to Kemet, to that land now known as Egypt, over 20 times, nearly 24 times, and also traveled extensively in Ethiopia and in Ghana, West Africa, and other parts of the world, really trying to not only understand the history of people of African descent, but also our spiritual practices. And I was saying to you earlier that it's exciting to be able to talk to someone who wants to talk about being a practitioner. Because usually when I'm on the internet, some folks might know me primarily from Sonnet or TV studios. I'm talking primarily about history. In fact, it's interesting because I have to tell people sometimes when I'm on Sonnet, you're really getting the historian more than you're getting the practitioner. They speak to me like I'm a practitioner. I'm like, I am a practitioner, but I'm talking about history right now. So
Yeah,
that part is very interesting for me. I'm a Kemetic high priest, so I am a practitioner, and it's what I do every day. I have a large number, nearing 150 members, and a larger number of people who are connected to the Shrine of Ma'at that I assist with their daily walk in divine balance. And that has been perhaps the most edifying thing that I've ever done with my life.
that's great. So just to jump back a little bit, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned your Kemetic name. What does your Kemetic name mean?
The name once again is Heru Jeden Ma'at Aten Ra. And names can be translated several different ways, but the way that I look at this particular name is that I am the brilliant soul of light, really attempting to live in divine and eternal balance. And the light is really at both ends of the name. Heru, some folks know that Heru can also be called the deity known as Horus, that the Greeks called Horus. But Heru is also the word for day. Heru is essentially a depiction of your connection to light, your connection to the sun. And so that's one of the reasons why I use that. But then also, you'll notice that I have Aten Ra at the end of my name. And Aten Ra is a philosophical depiction, a symbolic depiction of the sun at its highest point of the sky. And so that is another way that the sun has enveloped my name. And of course, when I say sun, I'm not just talking about the literal sun. I'm talking about embracing the call to higher consciousness, to being illuminated, to being enlightened. And that's the journey that I have been on for all these years.
That's cool. So how do y'all pick your other name, your Kemetic name? Does someone else get it for you? Do you pick something that resonates?
In the community that I became part of, for those who probably have not heard this entire story, I was raised Catholic, right? Raised Roman Catholic, went to Catholic schools all the way up until college. College was the first time I was not in a Catholic school. But at that point, I'd really begun to study the history of people of African descent in earnest. And at that point, it really sent me into a direction that I'd not initially anticipated. When I started studying African history, I did not think that it would take me away from my spiritual tradition. But the more I learned, the more I recognized that I was supposed to be someplace else. And so going into that tradition, I initially first started studying at the Somerset Society, which is probably the largest Kemetic gathering. They have chapters all over the world. They're very quiet. So if you don't know they're there, you don't know they're there. But they are. There are many, many different places around the world. And I didn't end up staying there entirely. I ended up leaving there and going to the Shrine of Ptah, which was founded and led by Baba Heru Ankh Ra Samad Se Ptah. Some folks online have seen him. Baba Heru was an elder, one of the first people to bring these ancient traditions to the West. And so he's my elder. He's been my elder since I was initiated in 1998. He's someone that I hold in the deepest possible esteem. He's like a family member, really, at this point. He's been part of my my support group since before 2000. I mean, just think about how long he's been part of my life. And in the Shrine of Ptah, people either chose their own names after considering what the journey they're on meant to them, or they also got assistance from the elder. And I did both. I mean, part of the name was a name that I was selecting, but as I was continuing my initiation and working with Baba Heru, he also made suggestions about my name. And certainly when your elder makes suggestions about your name, you listen, right? So he made suggestions about my name. And later I would become a priest. And so as you see my carrying Ankh, my Ankh actually encodes in many ways not only the journey that I'm in, but my name. And so this was a very important part of my development and becoming a Kemetic priest. But it was certainly Baba Heru that assisted me with rounding out that name. And you know, here's the deal. When you're on a journey, often a journey is marked by a name.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly Heru Jeden Ma'at Aten Ra is one of the most important names that I'm called. But keep in mind, Jabari Osaze is not the name I was born with. That also marked a certain stage of my journey. And just recently, for example, I became an installed chief in Ghana, West Africa. There's another name associated with that. So often when you're on these journeys, a journey is marked by a name. And so it is of critical importance.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you that because Jabari and Osaze are both Kemetic names. I was like, is that happenstance or was that also a name change?
Really, Jabari and Osaze are West African names more than anything. You will see Jabari on the east coast of Africa, but it's mostly one that you'll see on the west coast of Africa. There's some disagreement on that, but definitely they're names that come from two different groups of people on the continent of Africa. And to some degree, some of that was intentional. As I am African American, Afro Caribbean, clearly I could not draw my lineage directly back to the continent in a manner that I would have actually wanted to be able to do. That's basically the story of these Africans that were torn away from the continent, right? So I chose a name that fit into two different groups of people. Because that was part of my journey. And the full name is Jabari Gamba Osaze. I changed my name informally in 1994, where I decided the name and had some guidance from elders and others and told folks that was going to be my new name. But I ended up changing it legally in 1995, 1996. Because when I graduated from college and recognized that my employer refused to call me Jabari Osaze, which, by the way, is you should be able to be called whatever name you like, according to the laws that precede the laws of the United States. English common law says you can use whatever name you like, and that sort of raft of laws are the basis of some of the laws in the United States. So I could have legally said I wanted to be called whatever I wanted to, but I realized my employer was not going to abide by that. And the last thing you want to do when you get a job out of college and you're just working for the first time is go to court with your employer. So I just realized, I said, it would probably be easier for me to get to the point where I legalize Jabari Osaze, and that's what I did.
All right. So if you would talk a little bit about some of the training you underwent in starting out in Kemetic spiritual science.
The training is clearer to me now than it was then. Right? When I first decided, when I realized that I was no longer in Christianity, and I say that very intentionally because my goal was not to leave Christianity. The church that I was raised in is a loving church with wonderful people, mostly people of African descent. A lot of people were Afro-Caribbean. I went to school there. The families that are in that church, they have generations of children. So, if there's someone that's in the church now, I may not know that person, but I know their parent or their older brother, that's the kind of community in Southeast Queens that I was raised in. So it's not that I disliked the institution that I was part of. I just began to recognize as I did my study that institution was not disconnected from the entire history of Christianity and what happened to people of African descent. So as I continued to learn, there was a point where I realized that I was no longer a Christian. And that was a very, very difficult moment. It literally happened at a moment that I realized that I was not going to be the same person. So to some degree, some of that training began while I was still a Christian. Mm-hmm. I'd started studying history. I'd started studying, well, what did spirituality look like before Christianity? What did Africans do? How is it that I got to where I am? What happened in my lineage, my direct lineage, and in the recent and a bit more distant history of people of African descent in the West? As I continued to study that, I got to the point where I had begun to, in many ways, I wouldn't have called it that then, but I began to be a practitioner. I began to recognize the movements of the heavens and the movements of the stars as a divine, as above and so below. That the way that we should look at this cosmic journey that we're on and draw inspiration from the movements of the heavens, guidance from the movements of the heavens, and how we should order our life here on earth. I began doing that before. If you had asked me when I first started doing that if I was Christian, I would have said yes. Right? Now, I knew that there were people in my church that would not have liked me to continue to do that. Clearly, they would have been very uncomfortable with it. But this was the beginning of the journey that I was on. In 1990, when it became clear to me, I read several books, but the one that really set me on the journey, that turned the light bulb on, or in some ways opened another door to me, that book was Christianity Before Christ. I'm looking for my version that I have of it. By John G. Jackson. I'm not sure how many of you have read that book, but it is it's an amazing text. And it was in some ways jarring when I completed the book and I had connected what I was reading to the other things I was studying. I began to recognize that I could no longer do what I had done, that I was different now. It wasn't my intent, but it happened. And I remember reading the book, finishing the book, and dropping it right where it was. I was standing in my dorm room, 1990, a freshman at Cornell. I dropped the book where it was, and I literally walked out of the building into the snow. I didn't put on my coat. I didn't put on my boots. I didn't put on a hat. No scarf, no glove. I just walked into the snow. It was really a jarring moment where I was questioning what I knew about who I was, what I knew about how I and the people that had come before me got to this place, to where we are. It was frightening. So I sort of just walked out for a little bit. I remember coming back into the building. My roommate was then in the room. And I remember he was sitting on his bed and he said, "You dropped your book." And I said, "Uh-huh." Now he knew how important my books were to me, right? Because he made the mistake earlier of just taking a book off my shelf.
Execution.
And he realized that was a problem. So he knew they were important to me. So to just leave a book on the floor, something was wrong. He said, "Where were you?" I said, "Outside." He looked around the room. He said, "You didn't take your coat?" I said, "No." He said, "You didn't put your boots on? You wore your slippers?" I said, "Uh-huh." And I remember after him asking me those questions, he sat there and just looked at me for a long time. I know that he was concerned. He was like, what is happening for him right now? What sort of psychological, emotional, spiritual crisis is he in that he did this bizarre thing and I know you're in Texas, Brother Nelson. This is upstate New York in December. So it's cold. It's snow on the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, you could draw a straight line from that place to where I am now, and the things that I would do next in terms of trying to pay honor to ancestors, in terms of having a small altar even in my dorm room at that time, which a lot of people had no idea what I was doing. They thought it was strange, right? Actually also beginning to study more about how ancient Africans practice spirituality and trying to connect with those communities. Later, I would find out about the Somerset Society. I did not know about it at the time. And I literally, as a poor college student, sold some of my books in classes that I was still in, Brother Nelson. How you going to sell the book you still in the class? But that's what I did, because I recognized that this journey that I was on would take me to other people that were on a similar journey. I didn't know anyone else that was on the journey I was on at the time. And it was kind of a lonely place to be. And so I sold some books. I got on a bus, came back to New York City, didn't go to my family's home in New York City initially. I went directly to a Somerset Society with my luggage and just walked around and talked to people and did those sorts of things. Then I went home to my parents and they were like, "What are you doing here? Why are you in New York City?" And I remember not really being able to explain to them why I had come home. But really that's where it started. From there, I would do everything from studying language to studying diet. Most individuals who are in the Kemetic spiritual tradition in the United States today are either vegan or vegetarian. I began to understand more about the sort of the calendar, the Kemetic calendar, which is a complex thing. But there were all sorts of things that I began to do as I would then enter into a different form of spirituality.
All right. So how did you transition from just being someone who was researching to a high priest?
That's interesting, because that initial spark that occurred in 1990 would take quite some time. I mean, I graduated in 1994. I came back to New York City. I started being active in the conscious community of New York City, going to lectures and meeting other conscious Africans, and then also studying at a Somerset Society for really 8 years. 4 years more discipline in a more disciplined manner after I graduated. Then I would be told about the Shrine of Ptah by a coworker. I have no idea what that coworker is, but she said, "It seems to me like you should come visit the Shrine of Ptah." And I said, "I have no interest in going to the Shrine of Ptah. I'm happy at a Somerset Society." And she said, "Just come by. I mean, we have a meeting tonight." And I went there. And literally after meeting Baba Heru in that community, I never returned to the Somerset Society. There's nothing wrong with the Somerset Society. I just recognized that this is where I was supposed to be. And in many ways, as that happened in 1997 or so, I would still be part of that community. I'm still part of that community. So I was initiated into the Shrine of Ptah in 1998, became a member of the Shrine of Ptah, and declared my interest in becoming a priest to Baba Heru Ankh-Ra Samad Se Ptah. We worked together for 13 years. 13 years. And then I was actually given an Ankh, given a carrying Ankh and named priest. So there was a lot that happened in between there. But that's really what happened. And in taking an Ankh, Baba Heru really gave me the charge, with my wife Anika Daniels Osaze, gave us the charge that I would be opening the Shrine of Ma'at. We had talked about Ma'at, and Ma'at is clearly the image of the divine order of the universe, invoked by a beautiful woman with a feather on her head. And from there, what ended up happening is I became the co-founder, co-chief priest of the Shrine of Ma'at, and for the last, I guess that was probably in around 2010. So from there to now, I've been running the Shrine of Ma'at, and they're a large. We have nearly 150 initiates, and we have our regular sessions and ceremony and public ceremony. And so it's been a journey. It's been a 30-year journey, in a 30+ year journey. I'm getting old now. In the Kemetic spiritual tradition.
All right. So could you talk about the Ankh?
Well, I'll talk first about my Ankh, right? So when you're a Kemetic priest, usually most Kemetic priests have a carrying Ankh, right? This one was crafted by Baba Heru. It's silver, right? It's made of silver. And this in many ways is a commentary, an acknowledgement of the fact that as a priest, I'm expected to have my life in my hand. Right, that this is my title in many ways, and if someone sees me with my Ankh, they recognize I'm a priest and that I'm there for their assistance. Right. The Ankh itself is a powerful symbol. It's a powerful symbol. It is one of the most important symbols in ancient Africa, and it is connected to. First of all, it's known to be the symbol of everlasting life. And there are lots of reasons why people say that it is structured in the way that it is. But one of the reasons is likely because this section here represents the female reproductive organ, reproductive unit. And then this represents the male organ. And then together we see them combined to represent offspring. There are some that argue about that definition. I was challenged once to argue, and I said, well, if there are reasons why that's the case, and if you want to discuss it, let's discuss it. But definitely that's one of the reasons why the Ankh is likely structured in the way that it is. It's a powerful symbol that was used for thousands of years, and in many ways even goes into Christianity, as Christianity is taken from the Kemetic tradition. We see, for example, the Coptic Christians use the Ankh very liberally. It's a very, very distinctly Kemetic symbol, but has been appropriated by others as well. So it's very important. When folks see me carrying a 2-pound metal Ankh, I often have to describe the symbol. Describe why you would see me carrying a 2-pound metal Ankh. They ask me, is it a weapon? Of course it's not a weapon. Of course it's not something I would do harm with someone with. Of course, you could also see it as something that would assist me in the challenges, the trials, and the tribulations that I and others would meet with every day. So in that sense, it's armor, consider it spiritual armor rather than weaponry. But certainly I would never do harm with someone with it. And then I have to explain to them that this is not just my symbol because you see me carrying one. This should be our symbol. This is a symbol that connects particularly people of African descent, but maybe not just people of African descent, but particularly people of African descent with our ancient origins. And so it is of critical importance.
All right. So could you speak to, I'm changing the subject a little bit. Could you speak to the monotheistic versus polytheistic presentation of Kemet, in the fact that there was one creator, Netur, and the netters are not gods, they're principles? Could you talk about that for, yeah.
Sure. That's a good question, because many people say that Egypt, the Greek name of this land, when the Greeks got to Kemet, they had to pass a city in the north, and one of the names of that city, it was known by this large temple that was there, was called Het Ka Ptah, the house of the soul of Ptah. And they could not say Het Ka Ptah. So eventually Het Ka Ptah became Egupt, then Aegyptios, and then eventually it was pronounced as Egypt. So it's really a Greek mispronunciation of one of Kemet's most important cities. And Kemet, and there are other names for this land as well. Kemet is not the only name, but it's probably the one that is most recognized by practitioners and historians today. I would say that your question was about, I'm losing track of the question because I started at Het Ka Ptah.
It was about Netcher and the Netters.
Yeah, this is a very important dichotomy, because I truly believe that the most recent traditions have sought to distinguish themselves from the older traditions because they say that their traditions are monotheistic, right? I truly believe it's a distinction that is not a value-based distinction. But many who are practicing the Abrahamic traditions have made it sound like they are the evolution of human spiritual practice. Like, people were doing some things and eventually we found our way into the right way, which is monotheism. That's kind of how it gets described sometimes, but I'll honestly say to you, true monotheism or true polytheism doesn't exist, right? In ancient Kemet, there is clearly, as you've mentioned, the concept that there was one divine force. There is one divine force, and that one divine force operates in specific manners based on the situation. And so if this divine force is all things, is everything, how do you name something that is all things? How can you describe the ceiling if the ceiling and the floor are the same? How would you describe it? So I would argue that in Kemetic spiritual philosophy, they decided that what they would do is they would name how the divine force behaved. Almost like the frequency on the dial of a radio, that you could tune into a frequency and have that specific concentration of divine energy assist you in certain instances. But at all times, they also acknowledge that the divine force was singular. So in some ways, that some people might call that monotheism, while also calling many names. They would say that, well, that's polytheism. I think this is not a helpful distinction. When you look at quote unquote monotheist, I was raised Christian, and I was told that, this is Christianity, but the deity in Christianity is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Isn't that three? I'm confused. No, but the three are one. This is the mystery of things. This is not a comment that's much different than what we hear the quote unquote polytheistic pagans say. And I know, as being raised as Roman Catholic, the concept of saints was critically important in the Roman Catholic tradition as well. So in some ways, what we are doing is we are describing differences in a manner, I shouldn't say we, those people that are part of the Western world, the folks that I've called the Tomhu, that others have called the Tomhu, the Europeans actually have decided that describing their traditions as singularly different and an advancement is helpful to them. While I disagree with their assessment of those differences. I really disagree with those. In many ways, we're all trying to describe this powerful energy that has created the universe around us. And our words as human beings pale in comparison to the enormity of this creative energy and principle. And so that's part of the challenge that we have. But it's certainly one that I have heard a lot about. Folks have all kinds of ideas about practitioners of ancient traditions. I heard a brother say the other day, do whatever you want, but don't have an idol. Unfortunately, I didn't get to speak to him. And I wanted to ask him, what's an idol? Is an idol an image that's supposed to remind you of a divine image, of a divine concept? You'll see that right behind me is an image of Asar, the divine force that's connected to resurrection. Does this mean, if this is an idol, which is what they would try to say I have, does this mean that I think that this is something more than a piece of resin? Am I saying that this divine entity that created everything in the universe can be encapsulated in this thing that was made by human beings? I don't think anyone would say that. But if you're looking at these, what they should do is be a reminder that the divine exists in the physical world. They should be a reminder of how to behave. They should be a reminder of certain principles. They should allow us to, in many ways, concentrate on divine balance. That's what they are. That's it. That's it. I make no impression that any soul inhabits this piece of resin. And so folks have all kinds of interesting depictions, whether you're talking about polytheism or the worship of idols, or being an animist, or saying that it's incorrect for us to look at the heavens to decide how we should behave. There are all sorts of things that I've heard, these inappropriate and confusing commentaries that have been levied upon people who are not in the Abrahamic traditions. And so we need to speak about these, come to a better understanding of these traditions, and perhaps truly on our own, on their own merits, decide how we should actually see our spiritual practices.
All right. So Black Panther just came out, the second one, and the god in there is Bastet, or Bast. Could you talk about Bast in actual Kemetic spirituality versus the superhero personified form that we get in fiction?
I think that first of all, it's amazing that Black Panther calls the names of Kemetic deities, right? When you read the comic book, you will see that there's that Bastet is certainly there, and Sekhmet is also there. That these are two of the most important deities in Wakanda, right, in this fictional place. But they actually are descriptions of the divine that come from ancient Kemet. I think that that's fascinating, that we're hearing the names that were spoken by our ancient African ancestors, spoken on the big screen once more, and without ridicule. In the latest version of Black Panther, the second movie, you actually hear a woman of science, Shuri, the sister of the former Black Panther, start with a prayer to Bast. The movie starts, the screen is black, and she's praying to Bast. And she's saying, listen, I have questions about who you are, but I need you to help me at this moment because I'm trying to heal my brother. That's essentially what you hear. By the way, if you haven't seen the movie and I'm spoiling it, what are you waiting for? This is January. The movie came out in November. Don't be mad at me. So certainly that's part of the depiction. We also see what looks to be Bast. I don't know if you saw, I'm a comic book nerd as well. So I don't know if you saw Thor: Love and Thunder. If you look closely, when he is in the city of the gods, Bast is sitting there.
Yes.
Personified as an African woman that has cat features, right?
And that's huge because they usually don't let Egyptians be black.
Right. But why are they doing that? Because they've connected it to Wakanda. That's what they've done, right? So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Most people could miss it. If you've seen the movie, you could easily miss it. And if you did miss it, just Google Bast, Thor: Love and Thunder, and you'll see the images, the screenshots that people have shown of this image. So it is fascinating to me. I do believe that perhaps more people will hear these names and find interest in these ancient traditions. Bast, as for those who are not familiar with Bast in many ways is the nurturing, motherly personification of the divine force. She has a counterpart who is Sekhmet. Sekhmet is not a cat. Sekhmet is a lioness, and she is a warrior. In some ways you can consider Bast the fire of a fever that seeks to destroy a pathogen in your body. That the ancient Kemetic people would have thought that those were the fires of Bast. Bast is I'm sorry, of Sekhmet. Sekhmet is the daughter of Ra, by the way, you should know. And so these are all symbols. These are symbols that we ought to be more familiar with. So we're seeing an evocation of Kemetic spirituality in Black Panther. Of course, you know that when they do their Wakanda Forever symbol with the crossed arms,
the Asar position,
evocative of the Kemetic position of crossing the arms over one's chest. So this is fascinating to see that we're beginning to, in some ways, even if it's just in pop culture, discuss this form. And then of course Moon Knight came out also, and that seems to go into an aspect of it. They were very cautious on the issue of race, which was fascinating to me. But I think that hopefully this will allow people to recognize that there's nothing wrong with having a spiritual tradition that's outside of the three major traditions that exist in the world today.
Something that I found out, because I'm a nerd also, where Wakanda is on the map in Marvel is where ancient Kemet is on our actual map. So it's a very subtle reference that if Kemet had been left alone and isolated throughout history, their technology would still be more advanced than ours today.
I think that it's fascinating when we think about the world that they've created, that there's this secret world that has been observing the outside world for some time and has been more technologically advanced and more powerful for such a long period of time. This is a fascinating story. I think that Black Panther might in some ways lead people to African culture, folks that are not necessarily ensconced or focused on African culture. It's one of the ways that particularly Black folk can think about African excellence, can think about Black folks doing things on their own, in their own right, can think about Black people as not being subordinate or being conquered, but rather being proud and regal and powerful. And for most of human history, that was the status of the continent of Africa, right? The wealthiest, oldest, most astute, most technologically advanced place on the planet. It is recently that there has been, as Walter Rodney calls it, the underdevelopment of Africa. In that important tome, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That's a recent phenomena. And so if we can see ourselves as more once again, perhaps we can undo some of what has occurred.
All right. So still staying with the netters, there's a principle, because I've heard before that pretty much all of the principles of the netters can be found in nature and in reality, but also within the human body or within our anatomy in some sort. But one that I haven't heard people talk about is Apep. So where does Apep fit, not just in the outside world, but also within us?
Apep is the symbol of, in some ways, chaos, right? It is the philosophical description of things that are out of order. We see Ra in continual balance with a battle with Apep. So Ra is the symbol of the light, of the sun, and Apep is usually personified as a snake. Apep is trying to snuff out the sun, and so Ra and Apep are in battle. We also begin to see that Heru then battles Heru, who is in some ways a version of Ra, right? The grandson of Ra, the son of Ast and Asar, who the Greeks called Osiris and Isis. Heru, who the Greeks called Horus, is also in battle against Apep. There aren't a lot of people who would call themselves Apep in the ancient world, because in the ancient world, Apep was seen as chaos, right? But there were some people that were called Apepi, or in some ways called Seti, Set is another symbol that can be considered one of chaos. And so I find that fascinating that perhaps true evil doesn't exist in the ancient African mindset, right? There's a lack of order, right? But not necessarily evil. Because if a Pep or Set were clearly evil, we would not see people take them on as a name. In addition to that, when you go into the great tombs that exist in the Valley of the King of Queens, in that area of modern Egypt that is now known as Luxor, you'll also often see that these individuals who are making their journey from the land of the living through the passage of death into Taseket Ma'at, into heaven, what you'll see them do sometimes is you'll see them being protected by snakes. And at the end, it looks like they have to do battle with that same snake. So once again, a Pep is not, and I know that this not all the snakes are a Pep, but I'm trying to make the commentary that in many ways what we're seeing is the idea that even chaos is a part of us. We must bring it in, we must come out of chaos, but even chaos is a part of us. All of the Neteru are seen as personifications of the energies that exist in the universe. And that, yes, those energies are not just within us, but are us as well. It's a very powerful way to look at, I think, the Neteru of Kemet. It can be confusing. It's not as simple as saying that there's this one divine force that exists outside of us. That's, I think, a more simple concept. But it, in many ways, is one that doesn't allow us to recognize the divinity that's all around us and the divinity that is us as well.
All right. So there's a term that I've heard before, Heru consciousness. Could you describe what that is?
Mm-hmm. In some ways, what we see in the great narrative of Heru is Heru must do battle with a portion of himself that is connected to chaos. We see Heru fight for the light. In this story where he is being raised by his mother without his father, who was killed by his brother, we see Heru, the most powerful entity in the universe, learn who he is, figure out that he is powerful and divine, and come into his rightful divinity. In some ways, Heru is the narrative that we all must be on. When we look at particular deities in the Kemetic tradition, usually you'll see mother, father, and offspring. Often that offspring has a name that has the U sound at the end. Heru. Sometimes you can even look at Khonsu, who was the son of Mut and Amun, similar in that instance. I think that what we're really seeing is a subtle commentary, because the U sound is the plural sound in the Kemetic language. In some ways, I think what they're doing is they're saying that all of us must go on this journey. That Heru is not a literal person. How could there be a literal person that is a human being with a falcon on his head? Our Kemetic ancestors understood they were talking about divine symbolism. Now, I'm going to tell you, people often challenge me on this, and it is so absolutely obvious to me that this is symbolism. There is no person that has a bird head. There is no person that has a lion head. There is no person that has a jackal head. We are seeing that our ancient African ancestors were using some of the principles, the behaviors of these animals as archetypes for particular aspects of our being. And so Heru is that warrior against inequity, against imbalance. And we should know, as Heru is the falcon is one of the animals that has, one of the birds that has the largest wingspan, that flies higher than most other animals. And while they're flying higher than almost any other bird, a falcon can see the smallest thing on the ground. So this is a commentary of its ability to be on high, but to understand what's happening on below. That is part of the power of this. In fact, you could even argue that Heru could be translated as the one who was on top. You could translate it that way. And so this falcon can swoop down out of the heavens and pick up the smallest animal on the earth that it's able to see. In some ways, this is our ability to be above the fray that we exist in on the physical plane. So yes, we must embrace our Heru consciousness. It's one of the reasons why the first part of my Kemetic name is Heru. And it's also why I have to remind myself that I'm right-handed. And you'll notice that I wear this bracelet that has Heru on him on my right hand, because it's a reminder that as I do the things I must do in my day, try to do them as I am drawing from the highest, as I am embracing higher consciousness, as I am being the spiritual warrior living a physical existence. And so and that is in many ways the manner in which we should view Heru.
Could you talk about the journey from Heru to Heru-er?
Heru-er. In the Kemetic language either means older or great. And so there are lots of different falcons in the description of the Kemetic spiritual characters, right? Heru-er is the one that is closest to Heru. And in some ways, Heru-er can be confusing. It is believed that Heru-er is Heru the Elder, not Heru that comes through Ast and Asar. And I think there's a good argument to be made that when we hear about the creation of the Neteru, the first and primary Neteru, we hear that Ast and Asar, or Osiris and Ast, come forward. We hear that Set and Inbethet, or Seth and Nephthys, those are the Greek names, come forward. And we also hear that a fifth one comes forward, Heru. I believe this is Heru-er. This is a commentary that while Heru is the divine prince, he is equal to his parents. And he must, in embracing his fullness, understand that he is equal to his parents. In one rendition of the story, when these 5 deities are being created, it is said that Heru is born, but he's held in abeyance. In other words, he comes forward with the other great deities, but he's held back to then come through Ast. And so that, I think, is powerful. In some ways, this is the Heru-er, Heru the Great. This is Heru that has been fully actualized. And so I think that we need to recognize that we are both Heru and Heru-er on this great spiritual journey.
All right. So concerning the netters, I know that Imhotep is one that was a historical figure at one point. Are there any other netters that actually are based on historical figures?
That's a good question. There are some that argue that Asar is based on a historical figure. I don't believe so. I'm not one of the folks that argues that. I believe that Asar was always considered a mythological, symbolic entity. And we sometimes see that there are individuals who actually lived that actually existed, actually lived such a divinely inspired life that they are later deified as sort of divine ancestors. And in many ways, Imhotep is one of them. Do I have my Imhotep here? I don't have Imhotep sitting here, but Imhotep is one of those characters that comes forward in that manner. He actually lives. He seems to be the right hand of the king Djoser. He is the person that designs and builds the world's first building in stone, which is today usually known as the Step Pyramid. Its original name was Kebu Neteru, by the way, libations to the divine, libations to the deities. And yes, the Kemetic people did libations. And so this was an important thing for this incredibly astute ancient African to do. And one of the world's first recorded doctors, perhaps writes a medical treatise in a similar structure to medical journals that we see today, thousands of years before those medical journals existed. He is a priest. He is a prime minister. He is an architect. He does many, many important things. And after that, he is deified, so that Imhotep becomes one of the deities connected to healing. We see later in the late period of Kemet and after Kemet has fallen, that people from around the known world at the time would travel to Kemet to receive healing in temples that were consecrated to Imhotep. They would work with a priest there, and then they would sleep in one of the rooms. Sometimes it's called incubation sleep by modern historians. And it is said that when they would arise, they would have the answers to the sicknesses that ailed them, that Imhotep would have visited them and given it to them. So Imhotep became a divine character. And later, when the Greeks saw Imhotep, they captured Imhotep in the names of one of their deities, Asclepius. So that while Imhotep is one of the world's first recorded doctors, we know that doctors today who complete medical school often recite what's known as the Hippocratic Oath, as if Hippocrates was the earliest doctor. We know that Africans were practicing medicine long before Europe even existed. Before we have definitive histories of Europe, there were Africans who were practicing health and medicine, which was of critical importance. So we should expect that while people are saying the Hippocratic Oath, maybe they should be saying the Imhotepic Oath. Well, I find it very interesting that Imhotep is secreted in the oath because it also mentions Asclepius, who is the Greek version of Imhotep. But clearly we need to do more in order for folks to understand just how influential Africans were in the ancient world.
That's right on topic with what I was leading to next. So right now in media, Kevin Hart is under fire for saying that ancient Egyptians were black people. Could you talk about the pretty much whitewashing of Kemet?
Yeah, I think that this is something that we've seen occur for quite some time. And we have to recognize that it really began in the ancient world. I often go on a tour. When I often lead tours of the Metropolitan Museum, I'll show you the images of Ast, the mother of Heru and the wife of Asar. And I find it fascinating that, I'm wondering if I can show you an image. I find it fascinating that as we look at Ast, that the Greeks would later call Isis, we see something very interesting occur. We actually see that the Greeks and the Romans take this great image of an African lady and they merge her with their own deity known as Aphrodite. And clearly, this version, Ast Aphrodite, as I call her, or really Isis Aphrodite, as they would have called her, is a woman, clearly a woman of European descent. Fascinating to me that they've done that. So in some ways, what we see that Aphrodite, Ast, was taken into the European world, and maybe we should expect that powerful people should depict the deities as themselves. So that's really the beginning, right? That's really the beginning, but it's certainly not the ending. We then begin to see in the more modern world, and we're talking about during the enslavement trade and after, we begin to see that they're actually taking, you might actually see, this is an image of Ast Aphrodite here, if you can share it. You'll actually see her. This statue is in the Metropolitan Museum. She is clearly European, but notice she has this locked here, right? Because I think in some ways they have taken this great African lady and they're transitioning her to be of another racial or ethnic group. This is how it begins. For those of you who don't recognize that this is a version of Ast, a European contrived version of Ast, notice the sun disk and cow horns in the middle of her crown. So this is how it begins. And eventually what we see is the African image of Kemet in the Western modern world has almost entirely been erased. From there, what we end up seeing is we see a lot of either European depictions like Theobarda, who played Cleopatra, or Elizabeth Taylor. It also, by the way, Angelina Jolie was supposed to play Cleopatra. That may still happen. You should know. But know that all of that is, once again, the whitewashing. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy, right? Her ethnic background was Greek, but she is likely biracial. The very fact that everyone wants to focus in the Western world on Cleopatra is in some ways their focus on Europe, because for literally thousands of years before Cleopatra, there were Africans who sat on those thrones. And in some ways, you could argue that Cleopatra is not a Kemetic ruler at all, that she comes after Kemet has fallen. You could make that argument. So why all of this focus on her as a Kemetic deity? In some ways, I'd say that's like looking at George Washington as the head of the Cherokee Nation. I mean, that would be ridiculous. Just because they're in the same area does not mean that they are ethnically, racially, linguistically similar. But that is exactly what we see. I often show some of the images of some of the Africans, these people who are clearly African, who really gave us Kemet. One of the things that we also don't see, I'm going to show one more image without showing too many and overwhelming things. One of the images that we also almost never see, while there is probably a documentary on ancient Kemet every hour of every day with the 87 cajillion cable channels that we have, Brother Nelson, there will sometimes be a commentary on Narmer or Menes, the ruler that conquers the people that are on the north of Africa, the north of Kemet, of what would become Kemet, to put together two nations into what would be known as Kemet. We'll hear some depiction or some acknowledgement of him in some of these documentaries, but what they will never show is his face. This is his face. This is from one of his tombs. And I'm telling you, he looks as African can be. Look at his nose, Brother Nelson. Look at his lips. Look at his cheekbones. It should be clear who we're talking about. It should be clear who we're talking about. And this is not just at the beginning. We see people that are clearly of African descent all throughout the 3,000 years of Kemetic history. So because people of African descent were arguing about the whitewashing of Kemet, the fallback position based on the success of our argument was that then people would argue, well, the people of Kemet have always been ethnically what we would consider Arab, the folks that live there now. But they only can do that if you don't know the history. Because virtually everyone who has studied the history knows that there was something called the Arab invasion of Egypt starting in around 637. So somewhere around 642. So we should know that those folks got there at a particular time, and they got there after successive foreign rulers that were Roman and Persian and Assyrian and others. So we should not be surprised that the folks that live in the region now look entirely different than they used to look. And this is essentially what Chris Hart was saying. But you should know that there are now folks that are Islamic, that are Muslim in Kemet, in Egypt, modern day Egypt, that are now organized on social media to attack those people. I get the attacks as well. I certainly don't have the platform of a Kevin Hart. I wish I did. I don't have the stature of Kevin Hart, perhaps the most successful comedian in our modern world, right? But I still get the attacks. So in some ways, I should not be surprised. And I'm sure that Kevin Hart was a little surprised, but The reality is that he caught some flack and that he ought not have caught. This is not an argument that anyone should make. There's several books by early Europeans acknowledging what they were seeing. One of them, I always tell people, I've been telling people to read this book for decades. The Ruin of Empires by C.F. Volney. C.F. Volney. Volney goes into modern day Egypt and notices that in the monuments he's seeing the African who is currently being enslaved. Fascinating. So, and then when the book is printed in the United States, they print it with omissions from his words. Omissions. Because one of the things that he says is, now I recognize that those people who we are enslaving, who we are subjugating, are the originators of humanity. This is a fascinating concept, Brother Nelson. Fascinating concept.
Before I change the subject too much, could you talk about Het Heru, the golden calf?
Het Heru is, once again, also another symbol of mothering or nurturing, right? She's sometimes depicted as a calf, as a cow. In fact, sometimes when she's depicted as a cow, she has a slightly different name. Her name sometimes is Merhet or Merhert as the golden cow. But she's also depicted as a lady that looks a lot like us. She has virtually the same headdress that has the sun disk and the cow horns. And she is an important character in that sense. You should know that the Greeks end up calling her Hathor. And she is also the wife of Heru, who I've been mentioning as the falcon. So Het Heru is probably one of the oldest deities of Kemet, by the way. She probably has her origins in pre-dynastic Kemet. Because when we look at the palette of Namur, I showed you Namur, there's actually that device that seems to describe the period where he had to conquer the people in the north to take control. And you're going to see a version of what is likely to become Het Heru at the top of the palette of Namur. This is when Kemet becomes Kemet. So she is probably a very, very old deity. Now, it's believed that in this version, she was first known as Bat. But she is connected to what would later become Het Heru. So.
All right. So, you have a book, Seven Little White, let's see. Yeah, Seven Little White Lies.
Yep.
Could you talk about some of these 7 white lies? And I want people to buy your book, so don't talk too much about it.
You have it there. Wonderful, Brother Nelson. Thank you. Dwa.
Yeah. So I want people to buy it, so don't give away too much, but could you give like a general summary over the 7?
Yes. Well, you should know that the book was the brainchild of an elder who is now an ancestor by the name of Dr. Edward Robinson, who I got to know through my work with an incredible organization out of Philadelphia known as the African Genesis Institute. He was the elder of the African Genesis Institute. And it was how I became connected to Dr. Robinson. Dr. Robinson died at around 93. I think he was 93 when he passed. And as he was passing, he asked for the book to be completed. I thought that meant that he had started writing the book, but he hadn't. It was an idea. And so it was my job to take these ideas that I had to also organize in order to create the book. And you should know the concept is that there are many misrepresentations of African people that continue to hold us back today. They affect the way that others see us and even the way that we see ourselves. And so the book seeks to take what I argue are the 7 most pernicious, the 7 most negative and also most common of those lies, and shows you how they have been constructed to harm Black people. And so that's the concept of the book. And some of the, and I'm going to tell you, it was really an amazing experience doing the research for it. The first one is Caucasians are the original people. Number 2 is ancient Africa contributed nothing to civilization. Number 3 is the ancient Egyptians were Caucasian. Number 4 is Hebrew slaves built the pyramids. Number 5 is Africans were savages when Europeans enslaved them. Number 6 is Columbus discovered America. And number 7 is Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. These are extremely dangerous lies that exist. And there are folks like you and I, Nelson, that probably know that those are lies, right? Know that those are misrepresentations that have been weaponized against Black people. But the thing that I argue in the book that I think is powerful is that each of these lies have metastasized like a cancerous tumor. What do I mean? That while you may know that this particular lie is not truthful, you may not recognize how that lie has grown and situated itself in other ideas that we have. So, for example, you notice I use the word Caucasian. And most of us, when we're trying to be polite, call people of European descent Caucasian. But how many of us knew that the word Caucasian actually was created to signify that those people of European descent were the primary humans? That they were more advanced than the quote unquote Negroid and Asian and Oriental. Quote unquote. Those are words I'm using because that's what some folks were used in that time. So that when we say Caucasian, we are saying European, you are the original man. That's what we're saying. So we don't even understand how these lies have metastasized, how they've gone into the very culture of the Western world. And so the book argues that what you have to do is you have to tear each of these lies out, root and stock. And that is really important.
That's awesome. So talk about your show, Comedic Legacy Today. How that got started up and the concept behind your show.
Comedic Legacy Today was a show that my wife Anika and I created in order to talk about ancient African history and ancient African spirituality. And it was filmed out of Manhattan Neighborhood Network, which is a public access station here in New York. And it aired on stations all throughout the United States. And now many of those episodes reside on YouTube. And so it was a really important entity at the time that it existed. We hope to bring it back. And you should know it had over 100 episodes. It was a very, very prolific show. And we had the opportunity to speak to folks who were extremely important in our community as well. Some of them are ancestors. Dr. Robinson was on the show in one of the most, that clip is now all over Instagram and it finds its way back to me. You know, the clip doesn't have my name on it, but people will say, is this you? Yes, that was my show. Dr. Robinson is the one that deserves the shine for what he was saying, but that was the show Comedic Legacy Today. And so really what we were trying to do is allow people to understand and in the general public discourse that Africans were influential, important, and their traditions should be practiced. So hopefully the show will come back at some point because I really did enjoy doing the show and it was really powerful. It took a lot of bandwidth to do the show though every week, to film that show every week.
Yeah. It was your show that helped me figure out how old Infandishi was because the man just doesn't age anymore.
No, he does not. He says his age on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at that, I was surprised by his age too. I didn't know he was that old, but just know that was some time ago. So now,
it was like 11, 12 years ago.
Yeah. So that was a long time ago. So he's, older than most people would expect. Partially that's because of the way that he lives. As I said, most people in the comedic community, our diet is different. And in addition to that, he's also a martial artist. So the movement that is part of his daily routine is also what's keeping him so young. Yeah.
All right. So, could you talk about what is the spiritual idea of heaven that y'all have, as well as the concept of how the underworld works in ancient Kemet or Kemetic spiritual science?
Mm-hmm. In the Kemetic tradition, heaven is in some ways an idealized version of where we live now, right? So people actually live like we do, but in a place that has none of the challenges that we have. We see images of people who are reaping the fields as they are in this area that we could call, but has several different names. One of the names for it is Aaru. Aaru could be one of the early names for heaven. And I think it's fascinating that in this heaven, you might think, well, why would I need to reap the fields? I mean, I wouldn't want to have to do any work. This is just an idealized vision of the world that we live in now. Now, keep in mind, as far as I know, no one has gone and returned to give us a very clear image of what it looks like. So this is in divine symbolism, right? It's symbolism. But that's how we should understand what that transition is like. In the symbolic representations of this transition, you see that one who was deceased has to go before the divine jury, the divine force, plead their case. If that jury believes that they are deadlocked, that there are 7 or so people who believe that they should go into heaven, and 7 or so people that believe that they shouldn't go into heaven, then their heart needs to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If they're successfully weighed, they continue to exist and they go into A'aru. Now, there are some individuals who, based on what they have done or not done, they will not exist. And there are several different descriptions that seem to be present in Kemet. The most popular one is the one that I'm describing when you're being weighed. If your heart is being weighed and it's not as light as a feather, there's supposed to be a beast that exists near the scales known as Amut that devours your soul, and you cease to exist. But we also see an image of some people who are not living a righteous life, and they end up having to go into a fiery place. So that concept exists in ancient Kemet as well. They're both in parts of the Kemetic ideology. Why? Because remember, we're all trying to describe the afterlife.
What are some of the spiritual practices that you use daily or on a regular basis?
Well, I would say that it begins when I awaken. I do the opening of the way. The opening of the way is a ritual that was put into its current form by my elder, Baba Heru Ankara Asamat Sepata, known as Baba Heru often. And he's the one that created this ceremony, this ritual that helps us remember that we are divine entities. And we do that whenever we do anything important, and certainly at the beginning of the day. So it'd start with the opening of the way. I might also go have my quiet time to reflect on the scales of Ma'at and the practices of Ma'at, whether I have met the challenge of the scales or not. And then what I attempt to do is try to rebalance the scales to Siruj Ma'at, because the balancing of the scales is a critical concept in Kemetic spirituality. You'll see I have scales all over as reminders, right? All over the place I have scales. So the balancing of the scales are called Makite, by the way. The balancing of the scales is critically what a practitioner of Kemetic spirituality must do. And so I might spend part of my morning reflecting on what I must do that day to restore balance. And then I also would spend some time with the ancestors, spend some time feeding them, either literally or symbolically. And that time I tried to go into those individuals who went before, who seek to actually assist me in my journey. And those that I speak to them, right? Like, for example, my father passed just recently. And so I speak to my father. My father, I have a relationship with, as he is in the afterlife now. And so that's what I do. And for the rest of the day, I try to live in Ma'at. I try to balance the scales. By the end of the day, then I take a moral inventory, an assessment of how I've done. And I would actually ask for the guidance of the Netadru and the guidance of the ancestors to assist me in. I give thanks to them for allowing me to live that day on the physical plane, and ask them for assistance in helping balance the scales. And then it starts all over again. There are other practices, everything from meditation to ceremony to all sorts of other things that Kemetic spiritual practitioners utilize.
Are there any supernatural manifestations associated with Kemetic spiritual practice also? I believe I've heard you mention before that while chanting the word Ankh, you said that your sinuses cleared up.
Mm-hmm.
Are there some more things along those lines, or something a lot more mystical that may also be associated with your practice?
Well, I'll honestly say to you that those mystical occurrences are not universal for everyone, right? I mean, it depends on what you're doing and what mission you're on. I routinely ask for the guidance of the Netru and the ancestors. And sometimes if I am focused and attuned enough, during that day, I will receive messages, I'll receive guidance. Sometimes it's as clear as day that I have received the guidance I've been asking for. As clear as day. And so that happens. There are also times that ancestors will attempt to pierce the veil and communicate. They'll try to have input in our challenge. There are some individuals who have made fun of me for this, right? That I'm a person of spirit and I have a relationship with the ancestors. One brother on the internet says, I speak to mummies. That's certainly not what I said. It is not what I said. But clearly, what I think we all should recognize is that what we're trying to do is have a relationship with these great Africans and others who live the life that was balanced. We look for their guidance. We look for their assistance in this battle. If we believe that our ancestors are not destroyed by death, then we should believe that we can have access to them. In the Kemetic spiritual form, you'll notice when you go into a tomb, there's a large doorway in every chapel area of a tomb. Western historians call that the false door. Why do they call it a false door? Because they can't walk through it. It's extremely literal, and it misses the greater spiritual lesson. The spiritual lesson is that the ancestors can come and go, that they can have interaction with us on the physical plane. In fact, this is a concept that you'll see described in the main spiritual text, the Reyu Pert Emeru Ger, which has been unfortunately misnomered the Book of the Dead. It is described. One of the prayers is that you are asking for this ancestor to come and glow as they please. There you go. We're asking that this ancestor can come and go as they please. This is important. Our ancestors who lived in this great nation that gave so much to the world certainly believe that those who had gone on, who are no longer here on the physical plane, still existed and could still commune with us. And so we see that represented in the very structure of the tomb. You'll even see images of these ancestors depicted as birds with the head, their own head on top of the bird. In some ways, it's a commentary that they can simply be anywhere they choose at any time, that they're flying, not walking. They ain't taking the bus to go see you. They're able to communicate with you. And so this is part of my worldview and part of the manner in which Kemetic spiritual practitioners find themselves in communication with these ancestors.
Could you talk a little bit about the Ka and the Ba? I believe there's 3, and I can't remember the third one.
There are at least 9 different descriptions of the soul.
Okay.
In the Kemetic tradition. The most important, I think everyone would agree, would be the Ka and the Ba. The Ka is considered the soul that I call it the universal soul. It's a soul that you share with all of the people on the planet, right? Who have gone and who have gone into the afterlife and will come here as new beings, right? That's the Ka, and it looks sort of like someone standing or sitting with their hands at 90-degree angles. That's the Ka. I think it's supposed to be an embrace. That's where the symbol comes from. And then we see the Ba. The Ba is the one that I described that looks like a bird with the person's head on it. This is the portion of our spirit that has our personalities, our experiences. That's the reason why it's personified with our face on it. And this is an important depiction as well, that that portion of your soul also exists and can commune. There are others. There's the Kaibit, there's the Kat, there's the Ren. There are other versions. There's the Ak. There are at least 9 of them, but the most important are the Ka and the Ba, by far.
All right. So Kwanzaa just passed, and I've heard a few people do live streams, and they described everything but what Kwanzaa actually is. uh, so could you describe what Kwanzaa is, what the different candlesticks represent, and how's it supposed to be celebrated?
Kwanzaa is supposed to be a secular holiday for Africans, regardless of their spiritual traditions. Kwanzaa is meant to be a moment at the end of the year when Black families and the Black community get together and think about those things that we accomplished in the year or still have yet to accomplish. And that's the reason why Kwanzaa is meant to be the first fruits of the harvest. That's what it means, the first fruits of the harvest. And so it's supposed to be a time when we can take inventory of the things that we've done as a community and get better at the things that we need to do as a community. That's really what it is. And you'll see there's 7 principles of Kwanzaa known as the Nguzo Saba, right? And each of those principles is really supposed to help us look at a particular aspect of the way that we live as important so that we can take that inventory at the end of the year. So, for example, one of them is Kuji Chagulia, self-determination. We must define ourselves for ourselves instead of having others define and speak for us. This is a very important concept that was put forth by its founder, Dr. Maulana Karenga. And so hopefully as we look at Kwanzaa, we'll recognize that this ceremony allows us, this celebration allows us to hopefully as a group be better, as a group have some discussions on what must happen in order for us to continue our upward trend. And so that's really what Kwanzaa is. It's celebrated from December 26th to December 1st, December 26th to January 1st for those people who are unfamiliar. And each day you light a candle that represents each of the candles of the 7 principles in Nguzo Saba. And I have found that I used to really, I still observe Kwanzaa, but I used to really be all in on Kwanzaa to a point where myself and my friends, we used to have this very large celebration in Queens every year for Kwanzaa, the Kwanzaa Karamu or Kwanzaa Feast. And it was a lot of fun, and hopefully it'll come back into existence too. I'm so busy that some of the things I'd love to do are still on a side burner. But really, the Kwanzaa Karamu here in New York City that we used to do needs to come back into existence.
All right, so we're getting ready to close. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd just like to share with anyone that might see this?
I think that I want to say to people, don't be afraid to follow your inner guidance. Don't be afraid to allow your divine self to speak to you, your divine self to set the meter upon which your feet will strike on the path that you are on. Don't be afraid to do things that might seem to be different than the folks around you. I know that as someone who decided to really find themselves entirely inspired by African culture, while I live in a very Western place, and I'm a Western trained person, you know, I went to a predominantly white institution. That and sometimes those were at odds. Sometimes those weren't always. It wasn't comfortable being or becoming Jabari Osaze. It was very difficult. But I'm going to say to those of you, some of you may have a little bit, have fewer years behind you as I do. But let me say, don't be afraid to step out on that path, because the world that we exist in is one that rewards mediocrity. It is one that celebrates individuals who simply do what everyone else does. And in doing that, it is one that denigrates and deprives us of our African traditions. We must be consciously and clearly African once more. That is what I would hope that everyone would be able to understand. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about these concepts, because I don't always get to talk about them. You know, I'm the historian, so, or the hood historian, as some have called me. So I don't always get a chance to talk about how one can be a practitioner. But I think that it's of critical importance for us to do that. Really important.
So for the people that may want to become a Kemetic practitioner, where can they go?
Well, first off, let me say to you that the Shrine of Ma'at has public services every other week. Right? If you join if you like our Facebook page or you join our YouTube channel, you'll see our services are called Kemetic Ascension, and they're public every week. They're not recorded. They are recorded, but you're seeing something live. If you join us at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time every other Sunday, it is live. And so you can actually not just see the services, but you can be part of, join the community of practitioners. There are some individuals who don't necessarily just want to stay on the periphery and want to be able to learn more and do more. That's wonderful. If that's the case, then I suggest that you join a Kemetic shrine, that you actually become a member of one of those shrines. The Shrine of Ma'at is accepting its applications just as we speak. That window is not going to be open for maybe another 30 days or so. So it's really important, if you're hearing my words, that you go to Shrine of Ma'at. Ma'at is spelled M-A-A-T, .org, and you'll see the application and all the things that we do. Our goal is to make sure that people become stronger, better practitioners of these ancient African traditions.
What are some resources that you'd recommend for people? I know there's this version of the book with the wrong name.
Mm-hmm.
That Baba Haru told me was the best. Also seen that this is the version you use. And one of my favorite clips of you when you were talking with Garfield about Lord of Lords, King of Kings.
Yeah.
But what are some other resources that you'd recommend for people that want to study either African history or the Kemetic legacy?
Yeah. I think that book that you have in your hand that has been unfortunately called the Book of the Dead is a really good starting point. The challenge is it's not a narrative book like you might, when you read the Bible, it's a narrative. Here's the name of the person. This is what they were doing. This is what happened to them. It's not a narrative. It is actually a book of ceremony. So you should still read it, but understand that some of it might be a little confusing to you, and that's fine. Who said that becoming familiar with 3,000 years of African excellence would be easy? It just means that you have to do a little bit more work. And if you become a member of the Shrine of Ma'at, we actually have something that is in many ways akin to a Bible study, where we read the text together so we come to a better understanding of their meaning. So that is of importance too. And so that's another thing that I would tell you should do. You should always join us online. I mean, if you are part of Kemetic Ascension, you'll get a lot of it. You'll get every week, every other week, we'll talk about aspects of the tradition that you should glean onto. And we're not the only Kemetic shrine. We also have a sister shrine out in Newark known as the Temple of Anu. Their services are the Sundays that we don't meet. So go take a look at what the Temple of Anu is doing. There's a lot for you to draw from. There aren't a lot of books that you can pick up, but I'd say that one of the books that was influential to me in my development was Medu Neter 1 by Rao Nefer Amen, who was the founder of the Asaraset Society. There's even the Art of Prayer that is done by the head priest, the Nesut Beat of the Temple of Anu. I'm coming out with a book soon that will also help for new practitioners. Well, where do I start? What do I do? That'll also be something that you can do as well. And so I would suggest that if you're interested, recognize that our tradition, while books are helpful, our tradition is a practical one. It's one that where you are supposed to be doing things. Become part of those communities of folks who are practitioners, and your path will be much more clear in front of you.
Awesome. Where can people find your books?
My book is actually, I only have one book now. I'm working on 2 more that will hopefully be released soon. But 7 Little White Lies is on Amazon, or you can find it on JabariOsaze.com. You can reach me on JabariOsaze.com. Someone message the website and you'll get me. Or you can even email me at Jed, DJED, at shrineofma'at.org. That's another good way for you to reach me. If you're connecting to the Shrine of Ma'at, you'll get me, or you'll get one of our priests. I'm one of the co-chief priests, but I'm not the only priest. We have 9 other priests that are part of the Shrine of Ma'at that are doing the work as well. Connecting with one of the high-level practitioners will help you to truly become a high-level practitioner. And so I suggest that that's how you go about really getting ensconced. And there are even some of you that might think that you'd like to travel to Kemet. We host annual trips to Kemet and to Ghana every year. And you should go to our website and you'll see more about that as well.
All right. Would you mind if you could release a blessing over the viewers?
Let me say, and I'll do it in English so everyone knows what I'm saying. Well, let me give you an affirmation. Yeah, I'll give you an affirmation. Let me start by saying, Rupu Nuku Amiku Kemam Keperu in Enter Hayu. And I said, I am that I am, a shining being in light, dwelling in the light of the Most High. Go forward and do the work that you know you must do. We are those people that our ancestors were waiting for. We are those individuals that will turn the tide that has been, that our community has been engulfed in, that has prevented us from being our true selves. It's not time for you to wait for someone else to come forward. Be the leader that you need and that our people need. So let me say to you, dwell in the light of the Most High and do your work. Remember that there's those of us like myself and Brother Nelson and others who are on this journey. Reach out to us so that we can be on the journey together. With that, I'm going to say Shemin Ma'at. Go forth in divine balance, Brother Nelson.
Awesome. Well, y'all, that's it for this session. Jabari listed all the places that you could find him at if you're interested in what he's doing. To connect more with me, you could find my book on Amazon, Fullness, Guide to Sonship and Mysticism. You could also find the Cave of Mystery Facebook page or Patreon. These will continue to be uploaded on Thursday, so look out for more of these episodes as time goes on. All of you be blessed. That is it for this session.